Hi, and thank you for joining. My name is Dan Castle, and this is my version of how my capstone came together. In the next several minutes, I want to walk you through the process that I used in the hopes that perhaps some of the things that helped me might be of help to you. So without further ado, let's get started. As you can tell here from the title of this slide, this is my capstone process. While every OD degree at the University of Pennsylvania ends in a capstone, that process doesn't have to begin after all of your coursework. And I will try to make a case in the next several minutes about why you start that journey now, early on in your Penn academic career. This is my story. I'm sharing it here in the hopes that something will be of value to you, but as always, your mileage may vary. For me, the capstone process really has three distinct steps. The first is all about preparation, and in my advice, you should prepare and you should start now. Preparation begins with note-taking inside assigned course books for me. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, if I look at The Opposable Mind, one of the books that I was assigned to read as part of Devil's Advocate or Dynamics 551, you can see that I've used the inside of my book for extensive note-taking. Each one of these notes on the inside cover of my book aligns with a particular page number. And next to that page number, I've written myself a note that might be useful to me at some point in the future. Those notes correspond to notes that I've written inside the margins of the actual pages. Now the note here is really not of consequence to you for purposes of this presentation, but the point is that if you start taking notes inside of your assigned books early on in your class work, then not only will those notes be helpful for you for an individual class paper or assignment, but you can use these very much as a reference for yourself when it comes time to writing your capstone. The second piece of advice I would give you is to start a capstone journal. Now this funny looking one full of elephants is the one that I used. You can see again I've got various tabs, the specifics of which again are unimportant. But in this journal, which I carried with me all the time, I would jot down notes of ideas. Notes of something maybe when I'm sitting in a class, maybe I'm waiting for a class, maybe I'm just sitting at my son's basketball practice waiting for practice to end. But something comes to me, something that I think is worth pursuing, I capture it in that journal. The third thing I'll talk about is something called the course themes and the Penn Ven. The Penn Ven is an artifact that I created on early in my academic experience at Penn, and it looks something like this. Now, if you look at this and you say, what am I trying to accomplish here? Let me spend a minute and describe what I've done. The left-hand side here is really a very preliminary sketch of the Penn Ven. And as you can see on the more finished right-hand side, I've tried to lay out the specific class and the instructor that I had. So in this case, Dr. Michael Arena for Dynamics 603. And during that class and after that class was over, I wrote down the sort of key themes that I took out of that class. If you've had Dr. Arena's class, you know it's about emergence and innovation. There's elements of design thinking and very much an entrepreneurial spirit, as well as the importance of things like networking, the importance of sponsors, influence, etc. You can see here that Arena 603 is next to Eldred 612, or Dr. John Eldred's class on power and politics. Again, those themes were related, and you can see that networking, the importance of a sponsor, and influence are two such themes that those courses have in common. I used this method over the course of my academic time at Penn to try and keep tabs on what I thought each class was trying to pass along as a key theme of mine. Now, I used those later on in my own capstone to develop themes like networking or influence, writing chapters about each of those. There's a chapter maybe on moral courage, or a chapter on the role of storytelling or myth, and so on and so forth. This is very easy to do if in the very beginning of your time at Penn, you begin to record and reflect on what the key themes of each class were. I found also that reading the class descriptions was helpful in making that type of preparation. The next thing we'll talk about is idea selection. I think that, there's a lot to be said about selecting your idea for your capstone. And what I would say to all of you who are thinking about this phase is what you start out with may not look exactly what you finish with. And that was certainly the case for me. Don't be afraid to take, a little bit of a creative leap and think about what it is you really want to write about. This is not an easy process. Nothing you're going to hear from me or from any of the other speakers in this series is going to be about this being easy. But it certainly is attainable. But selecting the idea is probably one of the key steps that you need to make. And the sooner you can do that, the better. The last bit of advice I would give is really around the timing of the capstone class. Now, as an MPhil student, you're not required to take that class, whereas you are as an MSOD student. And it's my opinion that the Capstone class really ought to be taken sort of somewhere before the middle of your coursework. And I say that a little bit sight unseen because, again, I did not have to take that course, because I think it's important to begin to form, once you have an idea, begin to form your thesis, begin to form where it is you want to take your capstone early on. That'll do a couple things. One, it'll help you figure out if that's really what you want to write about and what you want to commit so much time to. The second is it will certainly give you the guidance and advice from the faculty in terms of how to put the different parts of the capstone together. And then the third is it will expose to you what you don't know or avenues that you should consider, which can obviously help you in course selection for the time that you have left. Again, just my advice, as I said in the beginning, and I'll say again, your mileage may vary. So kind of moving out of preparation into what I call the second phase, which is about organization. And again, the key theme or the key takeaway from me for all of you here is just start when you have a solid idea. You know, one thing I did early on again is assign identifiers to the sources that I had. I brought up the Roger Martin book earlier, and if I just sort of flip to full screen here for a second, what you see in this particular page that I'm showing now is this is a document that I put together early on. And you can see that the Roger Martin book I've identified as Book A. The title of the book is Opposable Minds. And the last column for me was whether or not this was a book that was assigned as part of my program. I'll come back to this in a moment, but having these book references by letter not only gives you the head start on how your bibliography will look in the end, but it also allowed me to create a searchable index, which for me was sort of pivotal in the creation of my final capstone. So moving off of organization for a moment, careful selection of your notes and the creation of stickies. Now, I'll say in full disclosure, I don't work at 3M. I don't own 3M stock, but I did use approximately 500 sticky notes in the course of trying to put my research together for my capstone. And the way that the research came together for me was going back to that book, that Roger Martin book I shared earlier. If I talked about Martin's book being source A for me, I would create a series of sticky notes that would correspond to the book reference letter as well as the page number from the inside cover of my book. And what those look like is something like this. Again, I'll go full screen here for a second. What you can see on these boards in front of you and what you can see in that mess of a wall in the room I'm talking to you from now is really every idea that I went through my book and selected. These became the raw sort of materials, if you will, for the capstone itself. Every one of those stickies represents a thought. And those thoughts organized on those white boards were all of the thoughts that I pulled out of the references that I had that I sort of gleaned from the particular sources. The picture on the right is a little later on in the process. This was me trying to sort those stickies into themes. And those themes, you might guess, came from that Penn Ven I shared earlier today. So the concept here was for me to try and figure out what are the key themes that I had that were going to be chapters in my capstone, and then to pull those stickies off the wall or off of the other particular boards to make cohesive lists of things that I could write about when I sat down to actually do the writing portion of my capstone. This was in no ways easy. It did take a number of different iterations, and as you can see here, this is really what my office looked like at one point in time as I was trying to make sense out of all these different notes and pull all these different ideas together. The final product did look something similar to that, and I'll share a picture in just a few moments of sort of what the process looked like for me once I had all of these stickies assembled. But you can see it's far from neat. It's a little bit disorganized, and it is kind of a little chaotic, but for me, this is the process that worked. Now, this happens to be the room where I also do my full-time work at home work for my employee, and this is actually helpful for me because it gave me a chance when I wasn't attending to calls or wasn't working on client deliverables to sort of turn around and look at this mess. It also, incidentally, gave me something to talk about when I was on internal Zoom calls, and people would say, like, what is that? What are you doing back there? And it gave me a chance to speak about the idea and sort of refine it, even in my own elevator pitch sort of way. The last thing I would say around organization is just iterate. What I just showed you did not come together overnight. It changed constantly. In fact, I still have, if I look over here, I still have a number of those boards just sort of laying around. Now I'm writing to you or coming to you in March of 2021. You can see there are still some ideas here that have yet to be put into any kind of capstone or any kind of final deliverable. Just to give you an idea, if I look at Here we go. If I look at this particular note, here's sort of the note as I've written it. And again, the details are unimportant, but here's my letter and number reference. So this corresponds to book Y, page 25. And for me, that meant go back to book Y, look at page 25 on the inside cover of that particular book, and figure out what the note was that I was trying to leave for myself, and perhaps even rewrite or reread that page in the book. All right, final part of my process is all about writing and editing. But as you can see there, I say, but not in the same session. And I think this is extremely important. For me, I was very good about writing daily at a consistent time. Now, whether you're a night owl or a morning person, depending on what your work life looks like, depending on what your home life looks like, give you an idea, I wrote my capstone in the midst of the COVID pandemic while I was home with 4 kids who were learning from school or learning from home. I was working full-time at home, and my wife was teaching full-time at home. So it's busy, it's chaotic, but finding a time for me that worked was in the evenings. I would typically I'd start writing between 7 or 8 p.m., and I'd try and write for at least a half hour or an hour every day. Some days I wrote total garbage, and some days I would have marathon writing sessions that would end at 1 in the morning or 2 in the morning. I mentioned here the book When by Daniel Pink. This is a book that, as an aside, I think is worth reading. Daniel Pink's work helped me identify when I was most creative during the day, when I was most analytical during the day, and it gave me a chance to actually write, sort of sit down and write the creative pieces of my work, since my work was particularly creative, at a time that I was best suited to do that, and to write my analytical sort of sections, whether that was the abstract or other pieces, when that was best suited for me as well. The second thing I would say is create a weekly page goal for yourself. I set out to write 5 pages a week for 20 weeks, thinking that at the end of approximately 5 months, I would have written 100 pages. Now, in my case, I wound up writing almost 170 pages in 7 weeks' time. And I share that with you because there were several moments where I would sit down to write, and I would write sometimes 20, 30, 40 pages in a session. Doesn't mean 30 or 40 pages of that session got used, because I'll come back to that in a second. But the importance for me was simply to write, and I would encourage all of you to write. Whatever it is that you write, just write. Get in the habit of doing that. In my process of all these sticky notes, I would retire those sticky notes as I use them. I had either a box that I would keep on my desk, or I had an old-fashioned sort of receipt spike that you might see at a restaurant. You can pick one up at Staples, and I would take those sticky notes off and I would stab them on the spike. A little bit fulfilling, frankly, at midnight sometimes, but more importantly, it reminded me that I had used that particular note. I didn't throw them out because sometimes I'd want to go back and say, if I was rereading my section, which again I'll come back to in a second, I wanted to make sure that I captured the essence of what that note was all about. Around stickies, don't feel the need to use all of them. As I mentioned in the beginning, I created about 500 stickies in my research portion and my organization portion. I wound up using a little more than 300 of them in the end. And I still have those 200 from the board I showed you. They're still kicking around. I'm still contemplating whether or not I want to write some additional material and potentially even publish the capstone commercially as some type of psychology or self-help book. But that's neither here nor there. That's for a different recording. The other thing I would say is write your abstract last. Even though it is the first piece that goes in the front of your capstone, you really can't write that until you've done sort of the rest of the work. So don't feel so compelled about that. Just put a placeholder in for it and don't worry about it. Speaking of placeholders, make sure you pay attention to the formatting that's required in the final capstone. I did not do that, and it cost me a little bit of heartache to actually reformat my document. Originally started out as a Google Doc, since that was what worked for me when I was corresponding with my reader and my advisor. But translating that to Microsoft Word and putting in all the required formats was a little bit of a hassle, so pay attention to that. I mentioned, again, in the title of the slide says this, like writing but not editing. Do not try to edit your work while you're writing it. I find that your brain is just in a different frame of mind when it's writing versus when it's editing. And if you try to do both, you're going to wind up being subpar at both at best. For me, I just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote in the evening. And during the day, I'd either get up early in the morning, or if I had a break from work, an hour or two in the middle of my day, I would sit down and then edit what it is I had written the night before. And not everything I wrote was really all that great. In fact, some of it was quite junky, probably stuff way after midnight or 1 a.m. But the important thing is don't try to do both at the same time. Here's a glamorous shot of me actually in one of those midnight writing sessions. You can see that I'm sort of sitting at my desk, a different desk than the one I'm talking to you from today, since all of my kids had gone to bed. You can see the various sources of books just sort of strewn about, both on the desk as well as on the ottoman next to it. You can see my pile of used stickies off to the right, and you can see those boards sort of covered with different topics. And I'm picking those stickies off the boards one at a time. I'm looking up the reference in the book that I had in mind, and I'm putting words to paper, albeit digitally in this example. When it comes to editing, I've already mentioned don't edit as you write. I've talked about writing at night and editing in the morning because that's what worked for me, may not work for you. I did wind up actually hiring somebody to edit my work in the end. I knew what my strengths were, and they were around the creative side and being able to write a piece of sort of comprehensive synthesis of my experience at Penn. I was not very good, and still to this day I'm not very good at grammar, and I wanted the finished work to reflect something that I thought was appropriate for the caliber of our program. So I actually went out and hired an editor. The person I worked with was great, very timely in terms of turnaround, and you know, yes, it's an expense, but I think the difference in the finished work is unbelievable. If you're one who's great with grammar and doesn't mind poring over it in that respects, more power to you. I wish I had met you sooner because perhaps we could have worked together. The last thing I would say is don't be afraid to kill your darlings, right? This is a very common literary phrase, but I'll amend it and say don't be afraid to kill your darlings, but put them on death row first. And what I mean by that is when I was editing my document, I created another document off to the side where I would routinely copy and paste sentences, paragraphs, sometimes even pages of material out of my working capstone document and into this sort of holding pattern or death row, if you will. What I realized is everything I had written for a purpose. And maybe that purpose wasn't exactly suited for the finished product. But in some cases, I did go back and wind up copy and pasting material out of that holding document and into what became part of my finished capstone. So don't worry about cutting stuff out, but really do yourself a favor and put it off to the side before you decide to get rid of it completely. As we're coming close to the end here, just a few other topics. Advisor and reader selection is really important. The best piece of advice I can give you in broad terms is work with someone that you find it easy to work with, perhaps someone that you've worked with in a different class setting, someone that you've gotten along with, or someone whose style reflects the style that you're looking for in your finished product. I think it's important to set boundaries and set expectations with your advisor and reader in terms of how long turnarounds of revisions might take. And really, again, just be mindful of that. All of the advisors and readers are very busy professionals. I even had one tell me, I'm sorry I don't have the time to help you. I wish I could, but I can't. And I really respected that person for not wasting my time and taking on a piece of work that they wouldn't be able to finish on time. Capstone writing is in its own semester. I did not know that, so plan for it accordingly along with work and life. What this means is if you are writing your capstone, that's the only class you're registered for that particular semester. You can't be registered to write your capstone and take another class at the same time. So put that into your scheduling. If you've got major work initiatives coming up, you're in the middle of a merger, or you've got a big family vacation planned, maybe that's the perfect time to do it. Maybe it's not. Again, all of us are different, and only you can decide what's best for you. So in the end, I decided to actually have my particular book printed. Here's sort of here's sort of the finished version of what my particular book looked like. So it's got a nice sort of graphic cover that I had somebody draw up for me on Etsy, and I had this particular book bound at a publishing company called Presto Photo. So in my particular case, I wanted something that I could keep. I wanted something that I could sort of put on my bookshelf, and I wanted something that I could look back at over time and say, yeah, this was something that I created, and that's it. So I want to end by saying thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for paying attention to this series. My hope is that it's helpful for you. Hopefully we'll get together soon, whether that's in person or online, and I look forward to chatting with you about any questions you might have for me about the process. Thank you, and good luck.